abrogation, knowing nasikh and mansukh is very important. This is probably the most difficult area in Quranic studies, I would argue. There's a lot of debate about it. There's definitely exaggeration from the ulama. I think you'll find literally some of the scholars will argue that there are, a few hundred ayahs abrogated and things like this. Imam Suyuti took it down in his famous book Al-Itqan. He argues that there were 21 ayahs that were abrogated. Shah Wali Allah Kandahlawi, the great mujtahid from India, probably one of the last truly vast scholars that was arguably a mujtahid, actually argued there were only 5 that were abrogated. So there's a lot of debate about abrogation. This idea that the ayat as-sayf, which is in Surah Muhammad, the 47th surah in the Quran, the idea that the ayat as-sayf, the sign of the sword, abrogated all those Meccan surahs is completely insane. And that, unfortunately, is things that people like these extremists have used, like ISIS and things like that. They've used that, arguing that. And unfortunately, some of the ulama did make those arguments, which is tragic. But so it is in the books, but it's not normative, and it shouldn't be seen as normative. So abrogation is very important to know. People say, why, how could you have abrogation in Islam? Well, first of all, the Jews and the Christians debate about this, because the New Testament abrogates a lot of the Old Testament. So that's part of the point of abrogation, is it showing that things do change. The Prophet ﷺ had circumstances, and then later the circumstances changed. In Mecca, he wasn't allowed to fight. In Medina, because he had state authority, he was allowed to fight. أُذِنَ لِلَّذِينَ يُقَاتَلُونَ بِأَنَّهُمْ ظُلِمُوا. Right? Because they were oppressed, they were permitted to fight. And so, in that verse, in Surah Al-Hajj, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives the community idhn to defend themselves. Prior to that, they weren't, because the circumstances would have led to a kind of terrorist type of thing. If in Mecca, if they were given permission to fight, how would they fight? They'd fight like subversives. So, when the situations of Mecca are in existence, all those apply to Mecca. So when Muslims don't have state authority, they don't use vigilante violence. Violence has to be sanctioned by a state, unless it's in self-defense, obviously. But if you just remove any of that, then it becomes tribalism, and it becomes cycles of violence that never end. So that's very important, that abrogation and the concept of abrogation is actually very important. And even in the verse in the Quran, in Surah Al-Baqarah, there's 2 verses. One is in Nahl and the other is in Baqarah that mention abrogation. The verse in Baqarah, مَا نَنْسَخْ مِنْ آيَةٍ أَوْ نُنْسِيهَا. We don't abrogate an ayah or cause it to be removed. There's 2 qira'ah, nunsiha and nansa'aha. So it's same rasm al-Uthmani. So nansa'aha means delay it. So it might not be applicable in these circumstances, but in other circumstances it becomes applicable. And this is what's called tahqiq al-manat in usul. In usul, the manat is the cause. And so in usul you have the manat, the cause of something. The tahqiq al-manat is determining whether the situation that you're looking at has the same applicability of the manat in the original situation in which it. In other words, like for instance, when Omar removed the had punishment during the famine, because theft, its Quran is very clear, right? As-sariqu wa-sariqa. The Quran is very clear about somebody who steals. But in the circumstances that Omar saw when he was caliph, this is a time of necessity. people are starving. They're going to be doing things that they would never do in normal circumstances. So his حقق المناط, he said that the legal rationale does not apply here, because the theft is when things are normal and people have what they need. So if somebody's stealing out of necessity, it doesn't apply. So that's tahqiq al-manat, and that in essence is a type of abrogation. So what abrogation teaches us is that circumstances change, and therefore rulings change. And this is why Islam is not, it's much more casuistic than it is a kind of statute law. You cannot apply Islam like statute law. And it was only when the Europeans trading became so important that the Ottomans attempted to create a type of statute law for the Sharia. But the Sharia is much more like, I mean, I would liken it to naturopathic medicine as opposed to allopathic. In allopathic medicine, every asthma is the same. In naturopathic medicine, they're going to look at each asthmatic case differently. Like what causes it, what's the temperament. So if you're in Chinese medicine, you might give completely different herbs for one case of asthma than you would for another. I mean, I'm just using that as an analogy, right? Whereas the kind of cookie cutter model is not possible. And then you have hadith studies, which is very important. The Prophet ﷺ, especially the hadiths that relate to legal injunctions and things like this. So